Behind the glamour of Hollywood's golden age lies one of the industry's darkest secrets, the systematic destruction of its youngest talent. Today we are looking at 13 household names whose youth was entirely stolen by studio greed. These children generated millions at the box office only to be financially drained, psychologically broken, and thrown away when they hit puberty. How did the entertainment machine turn America's most beloved kids into disposable corporate assets? The truth behind these 15 ruined lives is far more ruthless than you ever knew. Number 1. Judy Garland. When you look at the MGM financial ledgers from the late 1930s, you don't just see box office receipts. You see a studio empire built heavily on the back of a teenager. Judy Garland wasn't just an actress to executive Louis B. Mayer. She was a highly reliable multi-million-dollar asset. By pairing her with Mickey Rooney in a string of profitable musicals and then placing the immense weight of The Wizard of Oz squarely on her shoulders, MGM created a formula that printed money. She was the girl next door who could sing, dance, and carry an entire production. The studio reaped the profits from ticket sales and intense publicity, using her image to cement their status as the biggest powerhouse in the industry. But that level of continuous output required a machine-like efficiency. To keep the revenue flowing, the studio essentially took ownership of her physical reality. Her days were not her own. MGM tightly controlled what she ate, restricting her diet to maintain a specific camera-ready image. More significantly, the studio managed her stamina to ensure she could work exhausting consecutive shifts under hot soundstage lights and then sleep when the schedule demanded she rest. She was placed on a continuous cycle of studio-supplied medications. The adults in charge didn't treat this as a danger. They viewed it as standard operating procedure to protect a financial investment. They took away a normal adolescence and replaced it with a chemically managed routine designed strictly for maximum productivity. The problem was that this system was entirely unsustainable. As Garland transitioned into young adulthood, the physical and psychological toll of those grueling early years became impossible to hide. When the exhaustion finally caught up with her, causing delays on set, MGM's perspective shifted rapidly. The asset was no longer reliable. After years of generating massive wealth for the corporation, she was suspended, and eventually her contract was torn up. The executives simply moved on to newer, younger talent. Garland was left to navigate the rest of her life, dealing with the profound emotional instability and physical dependency that the studio system had directly hardwired into her during her most formative years. Number 2. Shirley Temple. If you want to understand the sheer financial gravity of Shirley Temple, you have to look at the Great Depression. While the rest of the country was standing in breadlines, a small girl with ringlet curls was single-handedly saving 20th Century Fox from bankruptcy. She wasn't just a movie star, she was a standalone industry. The studio capitalized on her image to sell an unprecedented amount of merchandise, dolls, dresses, sheet music, and even soap. Fox executives realized that selling pure optimism during a dark economic period was incredibly lucrative, and they turned this child into the most bankable commodity in the world. From 1935 to 1938, no adult actor generated more box office revenue than she did. But generating that kind of capital placed a massive target on her back, mostly from the adults entrusted to protect her. To keep the Fox machine running, Shirley was expected to be perpetually cheerful, working grueling hours on set, while her parents and financial advisors managed the millions she brought in. What they took from her was her fundamental financial security. The adults surrounding her made disastrous investments, funneled her earnings into their own lifestyles, and failed to set aside a safety net. By the time she was a teenager, the astronomical fortune she had earned through her own intense labor was largely gone, siphoned away by the very people who were supposed to safeguard her future. The Hollywood system is remarkably unsentimental when an asset begins to depreciate. As Shirley grew older, she naturally lost the toddler-like innocence that audiences and executives demanded. When her teenage films failed to yield the same massive returns, the studio's loyalty vanished. 20th Century Fox unceremoniously let her contract expire, and the industry simply stopped calling. The most famous face on the planet was suddenly deemed obsolete by the business before she had even reached adulthood. While she would later rebuild a highly respected life outside of entertainment, her Hollywood story remains a stark example of how quickly the studio system discards a child the moment the ticket sales dry up. Number 3. Mickey Rooney. In the late 1930s, you couldn't find a more profitable commodity in Hollywood than Mickey Rooney. For MGM, the Andy Hardy film series wasn't just cinema. It was an industrial assembly line of guaranteed revenue. He was the energetic, fast-talking archetype of American youth, and the studio ran him at maximum capacity. Between starring in his own franchise and being paired with Judy Garland in highly lucrative musicals, Rooney quickly became the #1 box office draw in the world. He kept theater seats filled week after week, driving immense profits for Louis B. Mayer, while single-handedly cementing MGM's reputation as the ultimate factory for wholesome entertainment. But maintaining that relentless output meant operating entirely on the studio's brutal terms. What MGM took from Rooney was the true value of his own labor, along with his physical autonomy. Despite generating untold millions for the corporation, he was kept on a restrictive studio contract that offered zero equity in the massive hits he carried. To keep him constantly performing on screen, the studio subjected him to grueling, heavily managed schedules. His adolescence was entirely consumed by sound stages and promotional tours. He was treated as a high-yield corporate asset, tightly managed by executives and handlers who failed to protect his long-term financial interests. This environment established a damaging precedent, teaching him a financial dynamic where his immense earnings were routinely siphoned away by the people managing his life. The Hollywood machine is designed to sell youth, and Rooney's primary currency was his boyish energy. When he returned from serving in World War II, the landscape had fundamentally changed. He was an adult now, but his physical stature didn't fit the traditional leading man mold the studios demanded for post-war audiences. The Andy Hardy formula was obsolete, and MGM quickly lost interest in their former golden boy. His contract was terminated, and he was pushed out into an industry that no longer saw his value. The transition proved disastrous. Despite holding historic box office records, he found himself repeatedly filing for bankruptcy in the decades that followed, trapped in a cycle of financial instability that culminated in severe financial exploitation. In his final years, a grim reflection of the systemic greed that defined his earliest days in the business. Number 4, Natalie Wood. Long before she became a teenage icon, Natalie Wood was an incredibly lucrative asset for an industry that constantly needed precocious, wide-eyed innocence. Following her breakout role in Miracle on 34th Street, the studios quickly realized they had a highly marketable commodity on their hands. She was heavily utilized to drive box office returns and anchor publicity campaigns. For the studio executives and her relentlessly ambitious stage mother, Wood wasn't viewed as a vulnerable child. She was a reliable vehicle for continuous income and industry prestige. To keep this profitable engine running, the adults in charge demanded absolute compliance, often at the direct expense of her physical and emotional safety. What the system took from her was the fundamental right to be protected by her guardians. The most defining example of this exploitation occurred on a film set when she was just 10 years old. Instructed by the director and actively pushed by her mother to perform a dangerous stunt involving a collapsing bridge, Wood fell and permanently shattered her left wrist. Instead of seeking immediate medical attention, her handlers hid the injury, terrified that any delay in production might damage her reputation with the studio. She was taught at a very early age that her physical well-being was entirely secondary to the shooting schedule and the bottom line. While Wood successfully transitioned into adult roles, unlike many of her peers, the Hollywood system never truly stopped treating her as a controlled product. When she eventually attempted to assert her independence and push back against restrictive studio contracts, she was met with punitive suspensions and fierce resistance from the executives. The industry that built her name also embedded deep, lifelong anxieties. She was left to navigate severe emotional distress and an intense underlying fear of the very environment that defined her entire existence. The studio machine didn't just extract her childhood, it hardwired a permanent instability into her life, demanding constant performance while offering absolutely no sanctuary when the cameras finally stopped rolling. Number 5, Jackie Coogan. When Charlie Chaplin cast a young boy in The Kid, he inadvertently created the blueprint for modern child stardom. Jackie Coogan wasn't just a popular actor, he was a global merchandising phenomenon, long before franchise branding became an industry standard. Studios and manufacturers were putting his face on peanut butter jars, caps, and dolls. He generated an estimated $4 million, an astronomical sum in the 1920s. For the studio system, he proved that a child could carry a picture and drive massive secondary revenue. For his mother and stepfather, he was an endless fountain of wealth, elevating them to a lifestyle of immense luxury, without them ever having to work for it. But keeping that wealth flowing meant Coogan was systematically stripped of the very fortune he built with his own labor. What his family took from him was his financial foundation and basic parental trust. Under the legal framework of the time, the money he earned belonged entirely to his parents. His guardians treated his grueling hours on set as their personal bank account, spending his millions on real estate diamonds and luxury cars. They didn't view him as a son to be protected. They viewed him as a legal asset to be drained. They took away the financial security he had spent his entire childhood securing, leaving him completely unprotected by the people whose primary job was to look out for him. The cold reality of the Hollywood cycle hit Coogan just as he aged out of his boyish appeal. As he grew into a young man, the studios no longer saw him as a bankable draw. The roles dried up, and the industry simply moved on to the next generation of child actors. When he reached adulthood and asked for his money, he discovered there was almost nothing left. He was forced into a bitter legal battle against his own mother just to recover a tiny fraction of his earnings. While his financial ruin forced California to pass the Coogan Act, a law designed to protect a portion of future child actors' earnings, the legislation came too late to save his own money. The industry that made him a global icon discarded him the moment his novelty wore off, leaving him to rebuild his life from absolute zero after his own family had already taken everything. Number 6. Patty Duke. Before she even reached adulthood, the people managing Patty Duke's career decided her real name wasn't commercial enough. They changed it from Anna Marie to Patty, signaling exactly how they viewed her, not as a person, but as a heavily branded product. For her talent managers John and Ethel Ross, she was the ultimate meal ticket. By aggressively maneuvering her into an Academy Award-winning performance in The Miracle Worker, and immediately parlaying that into The Patty Duke Show, they built a wildly successful television franchise around her. She was playing two distinct characters on screen, keeping network ratings high and generating immense wealth, while the Rosses collected exorbitant fees and consolidated complete power over her career. But maintaining this highly profitable, squeaky clean American teenager required absolute psychological domination. The Rosses didn't just manage her production schedule, they systematically isolated her from her own family to eliminate outside interference. To keep her functioning through grueling shooting days and suppress the early undiagnosed symptoms of bipolar disorder, they tightly controlled her environment and introduced her to prescription medications. What they took from her was profound her autonomy, her childhood, and her fundamental mental stability. By the time she legally emancipated herself at 18, she discovered that the millions of dollars she had earned from years of relentless television production were almost entirely gone, squandered by the very people employed to protect her. When Duke finally broke away and attempted to shed the identical cousin gimmick, the entertainment industry was incredibly unforgiving. She tried to establish herself as a serious adult actress in mature films, but the same studios and critics who had capitalized on her wholesome youth actively rejected her new direction. The Hollywood machine had no interest in a complex young woman trying to grow up. They only wanted the cheerful, predictable teenager they had originally marketed. Stripped of her earnings, severely judged by the public, and battling intense, unmanaged emotional distress, she was left to navigate a massive personal crisis entirely on her own. The system had extracted her most lucrative years, enriched her handlers, and then penalized her the moment she stepped out of the profitable mold they had created. Number 7. Scotty Beckett. If you look at the casting sheets of the late 1930s and 1940s, Scotty Beckett was arguably one of the most versatile and heavily utilized child actors in the business. He didn't just bring reliable laughs to the Our Gang comedies, he seamlessly transitioned into prestige pictures, playing the younger versions of Hollywood heavyweights and holding his own alongside leading men like Cary Grant and Humphrey Bogart. For major studios like MGM and Fox, Beckett was an incredibly valuable tool. He possessed a natural emotive screen presence that elevated a film's prestige and guaranteed strong box office returns. The industry recognized his unique ability to deliver mature performances, and they kept him working relentlessly to maximize their financial investment. But building an entire childhood inside the walls of major movie studios comes with a severe developmental cost. What the Hollywood machine took from Beckett was any sense of a grounded, structured reality. He was raised in an environment that demanded absolute professional discipline on camera, yet provided absolutely no practical boundaries or coping mechanisms for life off the set. The adults managing his career were entirely focused on his cinematic output, completely neglecting the fact that a child needs a normal educational and emotional foundation. His formative years were entirely transactional, leaving him dangerously unequipped to handle the immense pressures of growing up outside the studio gates. The devastating reality of the studio system is how quickly it abandons the talent it fails to protect. When Beckett entered adulthood, his boyish charm naturally faded, and the major roles abruptly stopped. The executives simply turned their attention to the next generation of child stars. Stripped of the only environment he had ever known, the transition was catastrophic. Without the rigid schedule of film production to anchor him, and completely lacking the life skills necessary to function in the real world, he fell into a severe and highly publicized decline. His post-Hollywood years were defined by profound instability, erratic behavior, and constant legal entanglements. The industry had molded his youth for their immediate profit, only to cast him out into a reality he was never trained to survive, leading to his premature death at just 38 years old. Number 8. Bobby Driscoll. When Walt Disney decided to aggressively expand his empire beyond animation and into live-action filmmaking, he needed a reliable human face to anchor the brand. He found it in Bobby Driscoll. By becoming the first actor ever placed under an exclusive contract with Walt Disney Studios, Driscoll was transformed into a highly valuable corporate asset. He drove immense box office revenue, carrying films like Song of the South and Treasure Island, and his voice and physical movements literally served as the blueprint for Peter Pan. For the executives, he was the ultimate publicity tool, the living embodiment of the wholesome, magical Disney brand that parents trusted and children adored. But maintaining the illusion of the eternal boy required the studio to essentially halt his natural development. To protect their investment, Disney completely isolated him. What the system took from him was a regular childhood and any semblance of normal socialization. He was pulled out of public school, placed into a tightly controlled studio classroom, and constantly pressured to project an impossibly flawless image. He wasn't allowed to make the normal mistakes of adolescence. The adults managing his life demanded that he remain Peter Pan, forever prioritizing the corporation's merchandising and ticket sales over his fundamental need to grow up. The tragedy of Bobby Driscoll is that human biology cannot be controlled by a studio contract. When puberty hit, his voice deepened and he developed severe acne that heavy makeup could no longer conceal. He lost the angelic look that made him profitable. The studio's response was incredibly cold and efficient. They terminated his contract shortly after Peter Pan hit theaters. The transition was devastating. Permanently typecast as the Disney kid, he was actively rejected by the rest of the entertainment industry. The sudden drop from being the center of the studio's universe to an obsolete liability completely shattered his foundation. Stripped of his identity and utterly abandoned by the executives who built their live-action division on his back, he spiraled into profound instability and decline, ultimately passing away in complete obscurity at just 31 years old. Number 9. Lee Aaker. In the mid-1950s, television networks were desperate for reliable formulas to capture the rapidly expanding post-war family demographic. Screen Gems found an absolute goldmine by pairing a German shepherd with a young boy named Lee Aaker. The Adventures of Rin. Tintin wasn't just a popular Friday night broadcast. It was a highly calculated, heavily sponsored marketing engine. Aaker quickly became a central pillar for ABC's programming, driving immense ratings and moving millions of dollars in commercial products, from Nabisco cereal boxes to toy cavalry outfits. For the television executives and corporate sponsors, this child was the perfect, highly profitable embodiment of American frontier innocence. But feeding a weekly television franchise requires a relentless, punishing amount of labor. What the industry and the adults managing Aaker took from him was any stable foundation outside of the studio lot. He was thrust into a grueling, fast-paced production cycle, spending his most formative years on dusty movie ranches and exhausting cross-country promotional tours, instead of in a traditional classroom. His entire childhood was strictly organized around call times, hitting marks, and satisfying the demands of a high-pressure production schedule. The adults in charge essentially traded his early development for syndication rights, prioritizing the immediate needs of the network over his long-term educational and psychological security. Television, however, is a medium built on rapidly shifting demographics. By the time Aaker turned 16, Rin Tin Tin was canceled and his voice and appearance had naturally changed. The transition was brutally abrupt. Having aged out of his marketable boyhood, the very producers who had built a massive television empire around his persona simply stopped calling. He was heavily typecast as the frontier kid, unable to secure meaningful adult roles and fundamentally unequipped for a normal life outside of the entertainment bubble. Without a formal education or a reliable support system, Aaker found himself completely adrift. The Hollywood machine that relied so heavily on his face to build early television audiences entirely discarded him, leaving him to quietly navigate decades of profound financial hardship and isolation far away from the cameras. Number 10. Tommy Rettig. In the 1950s, CBS struck television gold by selling the ultimate American fantasy, A Boy and His Dog. When Tommy Rettig was cast as Jeff Miller in Lassie, he didn't just play a role, he anchored an incredibly lucrative sponsored broadcasting empire. For the network and their corporate advertisers, Rettig was the perfect face of mid-century innocence. He drew in massive weekly ratings and drove immense merchandising value. The executives relied on his authentic emotional connection with the audience to build one of the most profitable and enduring franchises in early television history. But maintaining that perfect rural illusion required absolute control over a developing teenager. What the production system took from Rettig was his fundamental right to mature. He was subjected to punishing production schedules, working long hours on a highly demanding set, while completely missing out on a normal adolescence. Even worse, the studio actively resisted his natural growth, desperate to keep him looking like the small, dependent farm boy that audiences tuned in to see. He was trapped in a highly restricted environment where his physical and emotional development was treated as a direct threat to the network's bottom line. When Rettig finally aged out of the role and left the series at 15, he discovered just how tightly the Hollywood machine had boxed him in. The transition was a complete industry shutout. He was so heavily typecast as the wholesome kid from Lassie that casting directors flatly refused to consider him for serious adult parts. The industry had molded his entire identity for their profit, only to abruptly lock him out when he tried to evolve. Robbed of his career momentum and completely unequipped for the realities of the outside world, Rettig entered a long period of profound personal instability. He struggled deeply with the psychological weight of being discarded, leading to years of severe distress and heavily publicized legal troubles, a stark contrast to the idyllic life the network had originally forced him to portray. Number 11. Rusty Hamer. In the 1950s, the family sitcom was an absolute gold rush for television networks, and The Danny Thomas Show needed a reliable spark to keep audiences hooked. They found it in a 6-year-old boy named Rusty Hamer. He wasn't just playing a part, he was practically inventing the archetype of the quick-witted, precocious sitcom kid. For a full decade, his impeccable comedic timing drove massive weekly ratings, securing highly lucrative advertising contracts for the network. Producers and executives leaned heavily on his charm, turning him into a primary cornerstone of a broadcasting empire that generated immense wealth for everyone at the top. But the cost of anchoring a decade-long television hit was total developmental extraction. What the studio and his handlers took from Hamer was the fundamental experience of growing up. From age 6 to 16, his entire reality was confined to soundstages, punchlines, and rehearsal schedules. He was surrounded by adults who prioritized his comedic delivery over his education and psychological well-being. He was never given the opportunity to develop a foundation, a practical skill set, or an identity outside of the studio lot. The adults in charge treated him as a highly efficient television component, completely ignoring the fact that one day the boy would become a man who needed to navigate the real world. When the sitcom finally ended, the Hollywood machine simply powered down and walked away. The executives who built their primetime lineups on his back had no use for a teenage Rusty Hamer. Severely typecast and wholly unprepared for a normal existence, he found the transition impossible. He was entirely shut out of the industry, eventually drifting into grueling manual labor just to survive. The system had extracted his entire childhood for profit and left him with absolutely no tools to build a future. Unable to escape the shadow of his early fame and battling deep unmanaged emotional distress, he ultimately succumbed to the crushing instability of a life that the entertainment industry had completely hollowed out. Number 12, Anissa Jones. In the late 1960s, CBS found the ultimate centerpiece for their hit sitcom Family Affair in a little girl with pigtails named Anissa Jones. As the character Buffy, she wasn't just a television darling, she was a massive commercial industry. The network and toy manufacturers aggressively capitalized on her appeal, turning her into a walking billboard to sell millions of Mrs. Beasley dolls, lunchboxes, and clothing lines. For the television executives and her relentlessly ambitious stage mother, Jones was a highly efficient, high-yield financial engine. She generated incredible wealth and kept primetime ratings firmly at the top of the charts, carrying a significant portion of the network's primetime success on her small shoulders. But keeping that lucrative merchandising engine running required a disturbing level of control over her natural physical development. What the production system and her handlers took from her was the fundamental right to grow up. As she entered early adolescence, the studio desperately needed her to remain the 6-year-old toddler that the public wanted to buy merchandise for. They bound her chest to hide her physical maturity and forced her to act and dress like a much younger child on set. At home, her earnings became the center of a bitter parental custody dispute. The adults in her life treated her entirely as a working asset, pushing her through a relentless schedule of filming and promotional appearances that completely stripped away any sense of a normal, stable youth. When Family Affair was suddenly canceled, the Hollywood machine simply detached itself. The transition was brutally disorienting. Heavily typecast and carrying the immense psychological weight of a childhood spent entirely under studio lights, she found herself completely adrift. The executives who had built a licensing empire around her image had no further use for a teenage actress trying to break out of a toddler's mold. Furthermore, when she finally gained legal access to her earnings at age 18, she had absolutely no guidance on how to navigate the real world. Without a reliable support system and deeply unequipped to handle the intense emotional fallout of her manufactured childhood, she spiraled into profound instability. The industry had squeezed every ounce of profit from her most formative years, only to leave her utterly unprotected during a severe personal collapse that ended her life at just 18 years old. Number 13, Carl Alfalfa Switzer. If you look at the syndication contracts for the Our Gang comedy shorts, you will see one of the most lopsided financial arrangements in Hollywood history. Hal Roach Studios built an absolute comedy empire around a group of neighborhood kids, and Carl Switzer, better known as Alfalfa, was the undeniable crown jewel. With his slicked-down cowlick and intentionally off-key singing, he was a massive draw for audiences in the late 1930s. The studio executives utilized his distinct comedic timing to churn out dozens of highly profitable short films, building a timeless library of content that would go on to generate millions of dollars for decades. But the economic reality behind the scenes was incredibly bleak. What the studio system took from Switzer was basic financial equity. Despite being the recognizable face of a franchise that remains famous to this day, he was treated as a disposable, flat-rate employee. He received a standard weekly salary with absolutely no royalties, no residuals, and no ownership over his own likeness. While executives and distributors built generational wealth from his childhood performances, Switzer was essentially denied the long-term financial security that his own labor had created. The adults managing the contracts ensured that the child talent saw none of the back-end profits. The moment Switzer aged out of the freckled, goofy kid persona, the studio machinery firmly shut the door. The transition was a harsh reality check. He was permanently typecast, making it nearly impossible for casting directors to take him seriously as an adult actor. Reduced to uncredited background parts and bit roles, he was entirely locked out of the massive wealth his childhood image was still generating on television screens across the country. Left to scrape together a living through odd jobs like dog breeding and acting as a hunting guide, his post-Hollywood life was defined by constant financial instability. The industry had secured the rights to his childhood for a bargain, leaving him in a state of deep economic desperation, a desperation that ultimately ended in a fatal altercation over a meaningless $50 debt.